Hi. Several months ago, I posted on my Patreon page a ride through of Splash Mountain with commentary, and one of the comments that I got back was that some of my patrons would really love it if I did some ride throughs of other attractions, even ones that I didn't necessarily work on, for some potential insight into how the attraction was designed. And I feel pretty shy about talking with any authority on any attractions that I didn't work on. So I feel a little weird about doing that, but I can talk about, as a fan, the things I love about certain attractions. And rather than riding through them, I kind of would like to sort of take apart an attraction and then walk you through at least the things I think are super cool about them, which may not be necessarily known to people outside the theme park design industry. Uh, I want to really talk about the Haunted Mansion, which is sort of highest on my list of favorite attractions and kind of the high watermark for, I think, any attraction. And I think what's so special about it is the way that it uses a lot of the sort of design philosophies used in stagecraft and in filmmaking, and theater to create an incredible attraction that is, 40 plus years old now, 50 now, I believe. And it is still such a classic. And the way I'm going to do this is through sort of walking through the blueprint. And you can find sort of low res copies of the blueprint for Disneyland's Haunted Mansion. But it can be hard for someone who isn't used to looking at blueprints to understand what's happening in them. So what I thought I would do is, rather than just sort of looking at a static image of the blueprint, I've actually brought the blueprint into SketchUp, and I've extruded some of the walls out so that we can not only sort of look down at how all the environments work to create the Haunted Mansion, but also sort of dive in and get a feel for what the space feels like. Let's say if we were in the attraction and the lights were on. So I'm going to jump into VR Sketch. And here I am. This is the model that I produced in SketchUp. It's using a plan view found on the internet, and it's to scale. And I've basically extruded up the walls. Some information is available online. Some of it's just sort of my educated guess. But I wanted to point out a bunch of the stuff that I am really excited about whenever I think about theme park design, when I ever think about theatrical design, and specifically that time frame while Walt was still alive, when there was this bridging of attractions that would be found in sort of dark rides in an amusement park, and then Disney's interpretation of that, which was really influenced by sort of sound stages. And so let's just do a sort of lay of the land. This is the blueprint. If I look down on it, you'll see there's all still the writing that you find on a blueprint plan view that talks about what various elements are in here, as well as where the figures are located. I've decided not to go whole hog and completely recreate the Haunted Mansion. I don't think it's necessary for this conversation, but there should be enough in here to point out the things I love about it. One factor is that the Haunted Mansion building, which I didn't build, the one that sits inside New Orleans Square, sits just about here. And they had a problem because when they were building the Haunted Mansion, the Disneyland Railroad already existed. And rather than moving the railroad tracks, the tracks actually go over the top of, or right behind, the Haunted Mansion facade. So there needed to be a way for people to get people down into the attraction and under that railroad track before it sort of expanded into the larger show that we're familiar with. So let's just sort of look at this. This section here, you can see it's got a lower ceiling, and that's because the railroad track goes over the top of it. So those scenes on this side tend to be only one story. It's not till we get underneath it that we pop up to the taller walls. Here are the two stretching rooms. There are two of them, if you didn't know that, for capacity reasons. And these are really elevators that take you cleverly down to the lower level and then give you the effect of the room stretching and the portrait stretching. In Florida, the water table is so close to the surface that they couldn't actually dig a hole and put an elevator down there without it sort of bobbing up like a bottle onto the surface. So this one is actually an effect where the ceiling rises up to give the same illusion. They also don't have a railroad track that they have to deal with, but there was some expectation that a similar experience would be had in Walt Disney World as Disneyland. So you would come down these elevators or the stretching rooms, and then you make your way down this hallway here. On the right-hand side is where all the changing portraits are, and on the left-hand side is windows that have shutters that give you sort of a vague view outside where you see some sort of dead trees and there's a storm happening and weather. I think it's really interesting to note how much space in this entire layout is being taken for just that effect. Part of that is because it's a big square building and they have this corner, but part of it was to give a sense of depth, even though you don't get a really good view into that space. But you can see this curved line that represents sort of a backdrop so that it looks like it has a vista, and then there's some foliage and trees here. The rest of it's all lighting effect. This door right here actually is an egress that takes you out in case there's an emergency. And then there's a smaller sort of environment here for more of that sort of thunder lightning exterior. It's also worth, interestingly, to point out that these portraits that change, although now are an LED effect, were originally a rear projected effect, and they needed this amount of space to get enough throw in those projectors to be able to get that effect to work up here. So there's a very large piece of real estate that's spent backstage specifically for production media for those changing portraits. So we have the hallway here. We've got the two busts that appear to be watching you. And then we open into this sort of strange featureless area, which is the unload area, which for some reason, whether it was budgetary or aesthetic, there is really not a lot in here. It's kind of the void space. There's sort of a misty projection on the wall and some spider webs. But this is where the Omnimovers come down into the load area and then head up inside the mansion proper. It's worth mentioning the Omnimover, if you're not familiar with it, is actually a big snake that is biting its tail. It's actually running on a rail, and each of these vehicles is connected to the others, and it makes a big loop, and it loops right back to the beginning. And as it moves along, it has predetermined areas that will cause the vehicle to rotate where the art directors want you to look at any given time. You're really very much like the camera on a movie set, being focused on the things of importance. This is the reason, because it's all connected, that's the reason when they need to stop the vehicle, a vehicle to get somebody who needs help to get onto the Doom buggy, that the entire attraction stops, because like a long connected train, if you stop one vehicle, you stop all of them. So, and also it's worth mentioning that underneath this is almost the same amount of depth as the vehicle itself of the mechanics that both move and rotate the vehicle. So in this case, it's sort of in a slot in the ground, but once it gets up to the secondary area, those underneath the Omnimover system is easier to access because it is elevated. So we leave this sort of low area and we make our way up the stairs up into the hallway of many doors. And one of the first things that we see is the endless hallway, which is interesting because it is at least as long as this load area, and it has a mirror at the end that makes it just feel like it's going off infinitely. Also, if you peek over here, this is the grand ballroom or the grand hall, and it's also about the same depth as this endless hallway. So again, a lot of real estate has been given over to this effect of being able to look down this hallway that goes seemingly forever. And then we come into the hall of doors. Notice that the vehicles, although facing forward as they move their way up and then point toward the hallway, actually start going backwards through this area. And this is where the conservatory space is, where the coffin is located that the guy's trying to get out of. and we pass by the doors backwards, moving our way through until we get to this corner where we have the grandfather clock that's chiming 13. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get down into the model. Then we move over here to the seance room with Madame Leota. And this is a big sort of square shape, but because of the circular track moving around the central seance table, they've actually sort of put some duvetine or some black curtains that act partially as sound buffering, but also it makes the rooms feel vague, like there's no corners to it. It's kind of unearthly. And then in that black space, they've got hanging instruments that are supposedly being animated by the seance and making noises. Over here is a projection surface where they have a sort of a lasery amorphous spirits coming to join the party effect that happens as you're starting to head out the room. And then we move our way over to probably the most theatrical part of the space, which is this incredible sort of 3-story tall grand hall. And it's made of several pieces. One is that you are arriving elevated, so you're looking down into the space. And these arches are actually here to hide the fact that there is 3-story tall sheets of glass that are acting as the surface that is going to be reflecting the very physical figures that are going to be visible in the space as transparent ghosts purely by a reflection or a Pepper's ghost effect. So if you were to go in here in the model, you can look back down here and see that there is a floor underneath where the doom buggies are coming along. And down here, although it's kind of hard to see in all this scratchings from the plan, are actually the locations of the dancers and the partiers that are sitting at the table playing the organ and also dancing. What I haven't modeled here just for clarity, but to see into the space, but there's actually another floor just above the doom buggies, and above that are all those figures that are appearing as ghosts swinging off the chandelier, or the ghosts that are appearing in the portraits that are shooting at each other. And over here on the left-hand side of the organ, there's also a very tall space, and here in this location is the figure of the organist who's playing. And then this big open space has this giant wheel of ghosts that are spinning around, that appear, skulls that sort of appear to be floating up out of the organ. And then we make a turn to the left and we start to head into the attic space, which is sort of very clustered and claustrophobic, full of objects and pictures. And over here in this space that's behind the grand hall and to the left of the attic is this big rolling door. And this right here is the maintenance bay, which is an access door outside. But when the attractions is down, they'll open up this big rolling door, which interestingly isn't themed at all. All your attention is so focused over here on the right that they just painted it black. But they'll roll that up, and then it gives them full access to the attraction, as well as they can bring any of these vehicles that need work right to this door, and they can work on it. They could also pull off vehicles and replace them from this location, and then close it back up when it's running. And then we leave this area of the attic, and then we have this sort of elevated view down into this really huge space. And although I just have it indicated as flat, it's got a lot of topography. So there are faux hills that make their way up along the back, and there's also topography and topiary and fences and a big archway gate that you come through, as well as these sort of big scary trees, and all of which is peppered with figures and singing busts. It's worth pointing out, and we'll talk about more when we dive in there, these gray pieces here, they're actually theatrical scrim. And scrim is like a big curtain that, when illuminated from behind, becomes invisible. but also allows you to project onto the surface. So you can both see through something, but also have something on the surface of it. It's used a lot in theater. It has been used in the past at Disney parks. But the reason it's so ingenious here is it does two things. One, when you first arrive coming out of the attic, there's all these ghost shapes projected that are sort of flowing up out of the graveyard in the foreground because they're projected on the surface that faces these vehicles, and yet you can see through it. So you're looking through it to the topography and all the layers of the graveyard, but they also kind of act as a theatrical mist that you get more layers, it gets denser. So there's a real sense of depth that this space is infinitely bigger than it really is. And a lot of that is the kind of tricks you would find in both theater and also on film sets. All of it's elevated for ease of accessing, and also that elevation is so that they can get all the mechanism underneath the Omnimover. But if you were to be evacuated from this particular scene, you would very likely either take steps down and out a door here, or you might even find yourself back here leaving, and there's actually this channel here that's all elevated, like on it's an elevated stage, really, that the rolling hills are sculpted on top of. And then finally, we move our way through a crypt, and we see the hitchhiking ghosts. Right, but we get through to the finale, and then make a final turn where we see that a ghost is following us home in the form of a mirrored effect that that registers with the location of our Omnimovers, and it looks like the ghost transparent on the mirror, but not visibly in our vehicle. Is coming home with us. And a lot of space has been taken up back here, and you can see the faint sort of pill-shaped track that has multiple alternating ghosts based upon the hitchhiking ghosts, so that when your vehicle comes this direction, they're moving at the same speed, and they're locked so that they will appear to be sitting in the vehicle with you as you make your way to the unload area. And finally, this sort of simple version of the unload area, this is a crypt area where you get off of the vehicle onto the moving sidewalk. To the left is some wrought iron and some wonderful sconces, and a very, very sort of root-covered, lots of cobwebs crypts that finally bring you up the escalator up past little Leota, who's in this scene here, wishing you come back, and then finally out of the crypt that takes you back into New Orleans Square. So there's a lot of little sort of back paths, one of which is as the vehicle is returning back up and then down again into the load area. There is a break room that has some technical support, but also a place to sort of hang when you're not on duty. And if you, for any reason, have ever been asked to stay in the vehicle while it went around, you would go through this space. It has a very low ceiling because of the train tracks that are above, and then it dips back down into the load area. So that's the complete layout. I think one of the things that I love so much about the attraction is that it's meant to deliver the feeling of being inside of a house, and yet if you were to look at the layout of it, there's nothing house about it. There's really no logic architecturally as to why this room is here. It's all very ethereal. It allows your imagination to just imagine that this sprawling house is allowing you access to just portions of it, which also sort of feeds my imagination, because I wonder what portions have we not been allowed to see. We haven't seen inside a bedroom. We haven't seen the kitchen. We don't know what the wine cellar looks like. We don't know a lot of the spaces that normally a house would have, or a big mansion. We just get these pieces or vignettes that are all constructed to support the theatrical experience or story beat that is happening in that area. And that's very much like building sets in a soundstage for a movie, you build sets that don't necessarily physically relate to each other smack dab together because you have a finite amount of space to do it in. And so this space is built to allow for not only access underneath the Omnimovers, but also to do that amazing Pepper's Ghost effect with the ghosts all over the Grand Hall. So now let's just dive in here. I'm actually going to point myself down into one of the stretching rooms. So I'm now at the right scale for being in the Haunted Mansion, and this is the stretching room extended as high as it is when it hits its bottom position. And then imagine the doors have opened up into the hallway with the lightning flashing, and then the portraits, which would appear over here on the right-hand wall, they would be changing with the lightning flashing. So the windows are inset. Imagine that they have a lot of sort of the filigree that the doors have, lots of detail, and drapes and also shutters. So you're sort of obscured from looking deeply into this diorama behind it. But like I pointed out, it's actually quite deep considering how little of your focus goes into that space. We make our way, we're still sort of under the train tracks. We make our way past the two busts, which are inverted, so they appear to be looking, following us as we move by. And then we make a turn over here. The queue continues. There's been some additions of sort of an iron grate that kind of adds interest to this space. And if we look ahead, we see the sort of staircase coming down into the load area with the empty vehicles, suggesting what may have happened to its occupants that might have been in there earlier. And then we make a turn over here, and this is the area right before we step out onto the moving platform. There's usually an attendant here. It's worth mentioning that for people in wheelchairs who need special access, that door right there is one of the ways in which people are brought to the vehicles who can't come here necessarily as easily from the front. And then this is where we would customarily step into our doom buggy and have the bar pulled back for us, and we would hear our ghost host. Right beyond it, most of our attention is here in the vehicle, so we're not really paying a lot of attention to what's happening over here. In Phantom Manor in Paris, they've actually made this into a grand staircase with the bride standing with her back to us, looking out over a sort of blurry distance with lightning flashing. But in ours, with the exception of the Halloween overlay, this is a fairly big open airy space with sort of gobo projections of mist on it. So rather than ride it, we're going to sort of walk the track, very much like we would if we were able to get into the attraction when it was not up and operating. So we would make our way up the stairs here, and one of the kind of rules of theme park design is that if there's an area that you don't really see, you really shouldn't spend money on theming it. If it's completely in the dark, why actually go through the effort of adding expensive theming? So coming in this area, the theme of this sort of nebulous void is continued into this first bend. This wall is mostly just stucco, or pardon me, just a drywall painted a dark color, so you don't pay attention to it. And notice the vehicles are focused forward as they come around the corner, but then they start to turn, and I'll squeeze between these guys here, and their attention starts to go down here, which is towards this endless hallway. I haven't put a mirror at the end of it, but you get the idea. You can look down. It just feels like it goes infinitely. To my right, there's a suit of armor that stands in the corner, and to the left, there's a wing-back chair, and then this doorway has a curtain in it, which is blowing from a fan to add some ambience. And then down at the hallway, of course, there's a floating candlestick that's floating about halfway down. What's interesting is the same amount of attention that went into the door jambs here in this hallway have also been lavished upon these doors, despite the fact that you only see them obliquely as you're looking down the hallway. So then we make our way down this sort of hall of doors. What's interesting is that my memory is that we go down this hallway forward, but actually we go back backwards as we pass these doorways, partially so we look back over the area we were in with the hallway, but also it slowly reveals the conservatory, which is an arched area that includes the coffin that has the very first ghost we see, which is trying to pry open and call out, trying to get out of the coffin. And we pass by these doors, the iconic wallpaper, a couple of furniture elements and pictures. This doorway here is actually another emergency exit that takes you out. And then we move backwards. Some of the doors are knocking, there's moaning. And then this door over here actually bulges. I think in Florida, there's actually hands that are pushing and pulling it, maybe at Disneyland too. A big rubber flexing door. Over here is, in the corner, is this clock, this grandfather clock that is chiming 13. And one of my favorite effects in the Haunted Mansion is that there's a spotlight on it. And in that spotlight is this moving hand, that shadow of a hand that's crossing the face of the clock. And what's neat is over here behind it, you go through an arch, and up in that corner is the simplest effect ever, which is just a slow moving motor with a spotlight. And on that motor are three sort of paper cutout hands that have been rotating since 1969, creating that wonderful effect with like very little effort. So finally, we move our way into the Madame Leota seance scene. And as you saw below, it's got sort of a nebulous feel because of the duvetine that is hanging down behind you, all black. Those instruments would be hanging from the ceiling and moving around. And then this is the centerpiece with Madame Leota sitting at her table, which I've just indicated with the cylinder here. Originally, the right about here at the bottom was a projector that projected through the glass onto the mannequin head that is Madame Leota's face, so that you could always see sort of a bright spot that would appear on the dome of the crystal ball that she's in. Now it's actually eternally illuminated. The projection is inside the head itself, and currently it's floating around. So her ball is actually magically floating around as she's talking. So over the years, that effect has gotten better and better. And then as you're starting to leave this space, that surface right there is a projection surface where they're starting to, in theory, evoke ghosts, which are starting to manifest through her incantations. And we make our way sideways out of this room with a final glance at the seance, and then past this wallpapered wall, and we enter the huge grand ballroom environment. And like I said before, these arches here are are frames to support the large sheets of glass that are reflecting the ghosts that appear underneath us. And then there's a low ceiling here, and then above us are more ghosts that appear up near the rafters, coming in the windows and hanging on the chandelier. So let's just dive down into the room itself. So now we're down inside the set for the ballroom. And if I look back, you can really see that we're on the other side of the glass. You can see there's a definite inset under here. Down on the plan view, you'll see some circles with crosses in them. Those indicate the dancers that are down here on big turntables, which are spinning around. There's two of them for the dancers, and then there's another turntable that has ghosts coming out of the hearse that's parked outside this doorway, and they're all sort of slowly making their way in. Over in the fireplace area, we've got someone sitting on the mantle, and we also have Grandma who's sitting in an animated rocking chair, and the rocking is in sync with a rocking mechanism that's rocking the figure of Grandma over here underneath the overhang. So when you're up there, you can't get a view down below, but under there is quite a lot of mechanics that are giving that effect. Over here, you've got the wonderful organ, and then along the side here to the left is a very tall space, and there's a mark on the ground right there, and that indicates where the organist is sitting just sort of in a black void floating, and then he appears just by the angle we're seeing through the glass, like he's sitting here at the organ. And then above him, there's a slot here in the wall where there's a big sort of Ferris wheel of ghostly skulls with sort of torn fabric underneath them to make them ethereal, and they move slowly so that they appear to be rising up out of the pipes as he's playing the organ. So let's come back up here, and we're going to just get back here on this balcony, and then looking back, you can get a real view of how this room presents itself. And what you're not seeing here is the low ceiling, but that is there as well. So we turn the corner and we make our way into the attic area. And over here on the left, this is that maintenance store I was mentioning before that we just kind of don't notice because there's so much to look at over here on the right. And we make our way through this space. It has a low ceiling. I haven't indicated it, but the side walls representing the roof rafters are actually angled inward, with the dormers are actually built out. And originally, this is the area that the Hatbox Ghost was going to live. In fact, I believe it even says Hatbox Ghost here, blurrily. And originally, the bride was on the right, but now she's tucked over here on the left as a more elaborate effect. And we make our way under this archway here that's just big enough for our vehicles to pass through. Currently, on the right-hand side now, we have the Hatbox Ghost, who appears with his wonderful disappearing head and reappearing in the Hatbox effects. But this grand moment here, which seems so less grand by just this simple model, is where we get this sort of vista view of the graveyard. So these gray screens are the scrim that are hanging in layers. And even in this simple model, you can see that the layers become more opaque as you get further away, which is a wonderful theatrical way to create a sense of fog and depth. So when you're up here, it actually kind of gives it away that this is not that big a space. You know, maybe it's the size of a baseball diamond, but it's still not as huge as you imagine it. And a lot of that is because of these scrims, but also because of the foreshortening of those elements that are further away. It gives a feeling that the space is infinitely bigger or may just continue on and on for acres. Very, very effective. And then this scrim right here is the one that has the ghosts rising up. And then most of the edge has been obscured with lots of hedges and sort of trees and bushes and shrubs that sort of break up the surface and act as the backdrop for the figures on the other side. So now we come out here and we're making our way down into the graveyard, and if I turn around, you'll see that I'm seeing the backside of the roof, which would normally be angled, and the vehicles start to pitch back so that you're forced to look up, and there's a big snaggly tree with kind of a Snow Whitey evil tree face, and then there's a branch right overhead that has the raven that's cawing at us as we make our way down into the graveyard. And then the vehicles will start to turn, and then we start to angle through the arch gateway into the graveyard. And here to the right, there's an indication on the floor of where the caretaker, who's terrified and shaking his knees with his lantern, and his dog are located. And then over here on the left, as we pass through the gate, we have that ghostly quartet of ghosts that are playing instruments and sort of setting the tone for the musical of the graveyard. Back over here to the right, we have various tombstones. There's a big entry gate that's sort of backed by hedges, so we don't see too far in. And we're starting to get this feeling like we're utterly surrounded with things. There's a hill that goes up. There's ghosts on swings. There's bicycle ghosts that are going around a central element. There's ghost hounds that are baying at the moon. And then over here on the right, you can see a low wall or hedge backed by a larger hedge that has the singing busts that are right in front of that area you just came down from when you were coming out of the attic. And then your attention is brought back in this direction where you see the hearse where everybody's having tea. You see the mummy and Father Time or the old man trying to communicate with each other. And then back here over on the right, you're seeing some crypts with some projection effects inside of them. And then finally, the executioner, the opera singer, and the headless knight here to the right. All really wonderful, considering really the space isn't that huge, but boy, it feels endless and enormous when you're in the attraction. Finally, we move our way through a facade that looks like we're going into a crypt, and this is where we have framed the hitchhiking ghosts, which are wanting to come home with us. And then finally, squeezing through the doom buggies, our doom buggies are faced toward these. There's oval mirrors here that, like I mentioned, there's a track that runs around this black wall that has mannequins or simple animated ghosts representing the hitchhiking ghosts, and they appear to be in the vehicle with us. In Walt Disney World, they've replaced it with a very sophisticated and very fun animated effect, but at Disneyland, it's still the simple trick of a two-way mirror and then duplicate figures that are floating. Also, those figures just have their upper bodies because there's no reason to see the lower half of them because they're sitting in the doom buggy with you. This area has a low ceiling, partially just thematically, but also because we have the railroad going overhead. And then we step out onto the moving sidewalk. To the left is the inset crypts with the wonderful torches. And then we make our way up the moving sidewalk ramp past little Leota, who's wishing that we come back. We're going to take a sneak around the back way. So if we were to stay in the vehicle and not get out, we would go through this sort of tight, dark area. It would take us into sort of a behind the scenes of the break area that sits right in here. And then finally, we would see the Omnimover vehicles moving their way back down to the unload or the load area. So that is the Haunted Mansion. I think I've touched on just about everything. I think for me, whenever I'm designing anything, whether it's a dark ride attraction or it's even a VR experience, I'm always thinking about how the layout services the story more than necessarily whether the layout works architecturally. Our minds are willing to suspend our disbelief, to believe that we are going inside a house, although there is nothing house-like about the way that this is laid out. So I hope this was enjoyable and informative, especially for anybody who has not had a chance to really pick apart an attraction like the Haunted Mansion to see how it's constructed. And I definitely encourage you to look out on the internet for layouts and plans of other attractions that interest you and sort of do your own detective work as to how you think it works, how the sets were laid out, where the maintenance areas are, and how people evacuate when there's an emergency, as well as what about the design is forcing the audience to look in a particular way. In the case of the Omnimover, it's actually moving your eyes to look where it wants you to look. But in those vehicles where there isn't necessarily something that's moving you in that direction, what has the designer done to make you engaged with one piece of the scenery more than another? So thanks for following along. Let me know if you have any questions. Let me know if you'd like to see any more of these sort of fan walkthroughs of existing attractions. I think it's a sort of a masterclass in what you can do just by picking apart how attractions that work really well have been constructed. And it'll help inform your designs, whether or not you're designing theme park attractions or you're designing theatrical experiences, whether they're physical or they're virtual. Thanks for coming.